Okay, we're good.
Okay, well, welcome back. Gavin and I are here to discuss chapters 10 and 11, I believe that is, from Wrangham's book, The Goodness Paradox, a strange relationship between virtue and violence in human evolution. Chapter 10 addresses the evolution, well, the title is The Evolution of Right and Wrong. And this chapter basically presents Wrangham's argument that, his argument that execution, having occurred recurrently over human evolutionary history, not only did it produce in humans the domestication syndrome by virtue of decreasing, sort of extracting from the population individuals who were especially aggressive or tyrannical, but also, Wrangham argues, more than that, that recurrent execution of tyrannical individuals also selected for moral psychology, selected for our concerns with what others think of us, whether we're behaving appropriately or rightly or wrongly, and therefore, if wrongly, whether we might ourselves be at risk of execution. So we'll get into that shortly. Let me mention quickly that we will not have class next week due to the Thanksgiving break. And so the next time you will hear from Gavin and I will be the following Monday, the Monday following the vacation. That would be December 4th. 3rd. Wait.
Wouldn't it be November 30th?
I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. My bad. Well, November 30th. What day is November 30th?
That's a Monday. It's the next Monday after Thanksgiving.
Very good. Thank you. We have the wrong date on the syllabus. We have December 4th. Wrangham Part 6. I'm not sure why we did that.
Oh,
it should
okay.
Say November 30th. So, our mistake. On November 30th, we will discuss the final 2 chapters in the afterword from Wrangham's book. And I'll also mention that we will distribute the take-home exam on that Monday. Would it be that Monday? Or no, it will be... What day are we distributing that take-home exam?
I believe we distribute it on a Wednesday.
What day would that be? December 4th?
That would be December 2nd, I believe. Or maybe I can't remember. Whatever date is on the syllabus. And I thought the exam distribution date was December 4th on the syllabus. That's what I thought, but I might be wrong.
Well, it's interesting because it actually doesn't say. It says December 4th, Wrangham Part 6. Maybe what we meant there was December 4th, the final exam will be distributed. I mean, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So follow up with a message, a Moodle message, just to make sure we're rock solid.
Yeah, I'll make sure that, everyone...
I'm sorry. Yeah, hold on. I was looking at the separate dates for the videos. That was a separate document that you and I had crafted to make sure we were sending out the videos appropriately and, following along with the right chapter. So let me back up a little bit. So we are in week 12. Today's November 16th. I'm looking at the syllabus right now. The actual syllabus. Wrangham Part 5, which is chapters 10 and 11. Next week is week 13. No class. That's Thanksgiving.
Yep.
Week 14, our final week of class. That runs November 30th through December 4th. And for that week, we will discuss the 6th part of Wrangham's book, which is chapters 12 and 13 and the afterword. Yep. We will distribute the exam on December 4th. Okay, and what day is December 4th? Friday?
It looks like a Friday, yes.
Fine. We'll distribute it on December 4th, but here's the thing. Everybody, the students will have a week to complete it. And it'll be due by email, or actually by Moodle, I suppose, is how we'll do it. It'll be due by December 11th at 12:50.
Yep.
Why that time? Because that's the time associated with our course final exam. Make sense?
Yeah. Is the 11th a week from the 4th?
Yep.
Okay, good, because that's,
1 week.
that's how we usually do it. So you'll have students will have a full week from when the exam is available to when it's due. And do we want to say a little bit about how they can email me drafts?
Why don't you go ahead, say something, summarize how we do that.
Yeah, so um, the exam will be what, 4 questions total, 4 essay questions?
Something like that.
Okay.
A
And
small number of essay questions.
and each question will require you to write a few pages for, so it'll end up being like a 10 to 12 page document, something like that, but we'll, be more specific once it's written up. But
Yes.
you know once the exam is distributed, you guys will be able to email me drafts of the exam, and I will give you feedback on it up until 24 hours before the exam is due. So the exam is due on the 11th at noon or 3?
12:50.
12:50.
Yeah.
Okay. So 24 hours before that, 12:50 on the 10th of December is the deadline to get me a draft uh, so that I can give you feedback on it. So get it to me by then, and I can, give you feedback on your exam.
Of course, it would be better, would it not, if they before then.
Well, yes.
I mean, in other words, I think our policy generally is if you're willing to do the work, we're willing to do the work. So if you send drafts to Gavin, and if Gavin gets overloaded, he'll direct you to send them to me. We have the same grading system. You're going to send, and you can send a draft of 1 question at a time. You can send 2 questions. You can send 3 or 4, however many. That's on you guys. Whatever you send to us, we will review and get back to you with feedback as if it were your final response. Okay, but of course you can revise it according to our comments, suggestions. Bottom line is that if you're willing to put in the time and effort, there's absolutely no reason why you cannot get 100% on the final exam. And people do. People also fail the exam. And the key reason they fail is they don't turn it in. Okay, I mean, this is not complicated. Or, I mean, generally, people who don't give us an opportunity to review it do a little bit less well on the final than those who do give us an opportunity to review it. I mean, we're not interested in tricking you or in confusing you. We'd love for everybody to have an A on the final exam. Okay, that would be perfectly acceptable, given that all of those A's were earned. So that's the final exam. We'll distribute it on the 4th. It'll be due on the 11th. You'll have 1 week, and we'll look forward to hearing from you, either in bits and pieces or all at once. But we generally, as a policy, don't accept drafts after. In this case, we wouldn't accept draft responses after 12:50 on December 10th, which is 24 hours before it's actually due. And that's really just for peace of mind and just to keep us sane, because we really do, we are very careful in reviewing your responses, and we want to give you useful feedback. But things get too crazy in the last 24 hours. And so we ask that you give us more than that to get back to you, and then you have an opportunity to revise your responses and so forth. Okay, so let's see. I think this is it is clear on the syllabus, although maybe follow up, if you would please, Gavin, with a message reminding them that we will not meet next week. We will not have class next week. Our final week of class will be on December 4th. It'll begin November 30th. It'll extend through December 4th, right? That last week there. And we will distribute the final exam on December 4th. It'll be due by December 11th at 12:50, and perhaps it makes sense to go ahead and remind them that they're welcome to submit their drafts up until 24 hours before the due date and time. Okay?
Yep.
And, maybe encourage them. Well, yeah. just kind of lay that out to make sure everybody's clear on what's expected, and to encourage them to contact us if they have questions or concerns. Okay, I mean, we're both very reasonable, and we, of course, we realize this has been a particularly strange semester, and we're very happy to answer any questions or concerns that you guys have. All right, so getting back, actually, before we move forward, I'll circle back around and say a little bit more about Chapter 10 again, just so we can constrain all of this throat clearing to the beginning of our video here. Now, what we'd like to do at the beginning is typically address any sort of questions that came up repeatedly, or something that came up in reaction papers repeatedly, just to take a moment, take a deep breath, and tackle something that maybe we think might be less clear than it could be. So, Gavin, you mentioned that there seemed to be some concerns or confusions on a particular issue. So maybe you could say a little bit about that.
I had more than a couple people asking in their discussion questions about what pedomorphism is. So I thought we could take a few minutes to lay that out a bit more explicitly.
Please.
So pedomorphism essentially is just the term that Wrangham is using, and that I assume a lot of other biologists and primatologists use for a trait that is a pedomorphic trait, is one that occurs in the adolescent or child of a species. So when he talks about pedomorphic behaviors in adult bonobos, what he's referring to is childlike behaviors in young bonobos that are reserved into adulthood or maintained into adulthood. Or
right.
He also talks about homosexuality being a pedomorphic trait in chimpanzees that is pretty much absent completely in adult chimpanzees, but it is retained from childhood to adulthood in bonobos. So
that's right.
That's the relevance of pedomorphic traits. It's just Wrangham mostly uses it in reference to behavioral traits, but I think also there are some physical characteristics. Like I think the floppy ears of the fox might be a pedomorphic physical trait, but I'm not sure.
That's right. And another pedomorphic trait that he discusses is the relatively large head, bulbous head, or skull of humans, which is a pedomorphic trait insofar as typically among primates, a bulbous head is much more common in the infants or the young individuals among, say, chimpanzees. But it's a trait that is retained into adulthood in humans. Now, the key reason why Wrangham is raising this business of pedomorphism is that very often and typically domesticated species display pedomorphism, pedomorphic traits, traits and behaviors that are that appear either childlike or adolescent-like. These are traits that are retained into adulthood in domesticated species, like, he will argue, humans. Humans retain a variety of traits as adults that are much more common in non-domesticated primates during infancy, childhood, and adolescence. Gavin mentioned the example of homosexuality. One potential explanation or hypothesis for homosexuality is that it is a byproduct of domestication. That given that homosexuality occurs in adult humans, but it's much more likely to occur in infant, child, and adolescent non-human primates, with the exception of bonobos, which of course he also argues are a domesticated species, self-domesticated species. So, have we covered, do you think, the main issues of pedomorphism?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I mean, I guess it could become much more complicated, but Gavin and I will suggest that you not complicate it any further than we have just discussed it. Um, it Pedomorphic traits are those traits more typically common or found in infants, children, or adolescents of a species that are retained into adulthood, in this case, among domesticated or self-domesticated species. Okay?
All right.
All right. Any other comments or questions that came up more than rarely in the reaction papers or perhaps in the discussion questions that were posted or the responses to the questions that were posted?
No, not that I saw.
Okay, so everybody is still hanging in there and submitting their discussion questions and responding to at least 2 other students' questions?
Yep.
Good. Glad to hear it. I mean, that's, again, the whole point of that is not to create busy work, but to help, to give you an incentive, the students an incentive to stay engaged. We don't, grade them in the sense of, does your question reveal that you are an expert on the behavior? Or does your response reveal that you're an expert on the behavior or the trait or whatever it is? That's absolutely not what we're doing. Bottom line is, if you submit your discussion questions, and if you submit responses to at least 2 other students' discussion questions, you're getting 100% on these assignments. Okay, even if your discussion question reveals that you are deeply confused, or if your responses reveal that you are deeply confused, we're not grading them in that sense. We're grading them in the sense that you've turned them in on time and they're indicative of you having struggled with the material. Okay, that remains true in week 13, just as it was in week 2. Okay? So let's talk about chapter 10 then, the evolution of right and wrong. So we'll talk about the evolution of right and wrong, chapter 10, and then we'll move to talking about chapter 11, which he calls overwhelming power. And okay, so in short, or in brief, what Wrangham is arguing is that not only does the execution hypothesis account for reduced reactive aggression and therefore for the selection of self-domestication in humans, but Wrangham is also arguing that this recurrent adaptive problem, this recurrent selection pressure of execution of tyrants, built into human psychology a deep and abiding concern that one is perceived by others as a collaborator, as cooperative, as a non-troublemaker, as someone who follows rules. Okay, why? Because if you don't, you get killed. Okay, so our ancestors, according to Wrangham, are those men and women, okay, who were concerned about whether they were behaving rightly or wrongly, or let's just start with rightly, whether they were following the rules appropriately, whether they were treating others in ways that were consistent with social expectations. And this is because our ancestors, by virtue of the fact that our ancestors were not executed, they were not tyrannical, they were not social misfits, they were not ostracized, because they did not behave in ways that called on the coalition of adult males to execute them. So again, in brief, let me just try to say this in even fewer words. The execution hypothesis, Wrangham's execution hypothesis, accounts not just for the self-domestication of humans, but it accounts for the evolution of morality in humans, according to Wrangham. Is that a fair assessment, Gavin?
Yeah, I think so. And so he's sort of extending his argument from
That's
previous
right.
chapters here to go beyond, because he's applying this thinking, the execution hypothesis to not only men but also women, and not just to tyrannical behavior, but to behavior that lies outside the bounds of whatever group norms. So it's not, any specific sorts of behaviors per se, but more so just the psychology that motivates people to adhere to group norms and to be sort of aware of other people's opinions. And when he's talking about moral psychology in this chapter, and to an extent the next chapter a little bit as well, he's I think talking largely about group perception, not necessarily philosophical terms of right and wrong or morality, but just um, you know the sort of psychology that makes a person aware of other people's opinions and their sort of standing within a group and how other people feel about them, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. You just raised an excellent point, Gavin, and that is that it's not as if, well, Wrangham is not proposing that there's an objective right or an objective wrong. In fact, Wrangham is allowing for significant cross-cultural variation and significant cross-historical variation in what is considered right or wrong behavior. It's not so much the specific behavior. No, it's not a specific behavior, as Gavin mentioned. It's behaviors, when we're talking about the evolution of morality and what is right, are those behaviors that are perceived by the larger group as right. So he makes mention of a particular culture in which it was forbidden for women to hear part of the male initiation ceremony, or something like that, where it would seem like, well, that's kind of strange, so it's forbidden, and that's considered a deadly wrong. Well, in that culture, okay, the psychology is being used to make sense of a particular set of behaviors. In that culture, it's forbidden. It's considered deeply offensive for women to listen to the secret chants, of men. In another culture, it may be forbidden to eat a particular animal. And that very animal is regarded not just as edible, but as the primary food in a different culture. Okay, but it's the same psychology of it's the same moral psychology, but being applied to different targets depending on the culture. I don't mean to suggest that there aren't, a set of universals. I mean, there are universals, some set of universals. But what we're really interested in here in pointing out is that it's the underlying psychology that is universal. Assessments of right and wrong, assessments of what others in the group judge to be right or wrong. And Wrangham's point here is that human psychology is built, has evolved to be exquisitely sensitive to what other members of one's social group think and what they judge to be right or wrong.
Right. I'm trying to think what other. So he starts off this chapter with an anecdote about an individual who's, not necessarily tyrannical, but just sort of a troublemaker, ends up
Yeah,
being
definitely.
executed by his own family member, which Wrangham says is, often the case. And I'm not sure if we've covered that previously, but Wrangham does mention a couple times how executions are usually performed by, or at least with the permission of, family members of the one being executed, in order to avoid, Wrangham argues, in order to avoid inter-family conflict or retaliation. Usually when these people are executed, when troublemakers or people who go against the group norms are executed, it's pretty unanimous. Everyone in the group, including their family members, is usually on board with this person being taken out.
Right. And oftentimes, it's often an option that's available. If that particular, let's see, if that particular woman it was a woman who killed her son, right?
Mm-hmm.
If
Yep.
he had not done it, well, the tyranny of cousins would have. The group of adult men that formed the coalition that was sort of tagged as being responsible for executing or getting rid of troublemakers, they would have done it. But it does seem that in many cultures, there's either an implicit or explicit option for a family member to do it. Give them that, I don't want to say honor, but to give them that opportunity to decide when and where it occurs. But once again, if she hadn't done it, that the group of men that ran the show would have.
You know, let me know if you think this is too much of a sidebar, but I think it might be useful here to say that, I just think it's important to be careful when talking about this,
Sure.
so that we don't get confused, or so that students don't get confused. I'll just say it. We're not talking about group selection here, and
Yeah.
I think it can be tricky when talking about something like this, where you have something like a group of people deciding to execute a group member. Going back to Richard Dawkins' book, the first book we read in class, natural selection doesn't work at the group level, even if it's a group of people performing an execution or signing off on an execution. The selection pressure, to take out individuals who are tyrannical or who throw their weight around or who just don't care what other members of the group think, that's still happening on an individual basis. There are individuals who have traits that basically selection is not favoring, even if it is, selection by other group members, that still falls within the bounds of natural selection. Removing those individuals who are basically ill-fitted for their environment, to the extent that the population over many generations eventually comes to be, comes to consist of individuals who aren't tyrannical, who don't throw their weight around, and who, for the most part, tend to adhere to group norms. So, I just think that is important to keep in mind, and generally the things that we learned about natural selection and evolution from Richard Dawkins in The Blind Watchmaker are important to keep in mind as we read through this book and as we consider Wrangham's arguments here.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just point students to a particular page where Wrangham, at least one of the places where he addresses this business of group selection. And so this is on page 200, and he says, it's about halfway or a third of the way down the page. He says, however, group benefits are not the only reason that morality might have evolved. Even when moral behavior leads to group benefits and an apparent expense to the individual's behavior might actually serve his or her own selfish ends. There are various forms of this idea. A benign version is that group-directed moral responses lead to the individuals being able to form useful alliances for cooperation, as the philosopher Nicholas Baumard and others propose. A darker form is that morality is all about self-protection. I have suggested that capital punishment emerged with language in the mid-Pleistocene. Afterward, an individual who challenged the dominant culture could be in mortal danger. Sensitivity to social disapproval would have been favored as never before. As a result, individuals might behave in morally correct ways in order to promote their own survival. Group benefits would then be incidental. Now let me just pursue this for another couple of sentences. He says, according to this idea, which Christopher Bem advanced in his 2012 book, Moral Origins, and here's really the crux, the evolution of human morality was largely a response to the same power plays that self-domesticated us. We evolved to fear the killing power of the men in the group. The idea explains why group-directed moral emotions have been elaborated far more strongly in humans than in other species. So what may appear to be a group-level benefit, that is extracting, troublemakers, and may well be a group-level benefit. The argument is that it's incidental to the benefits that are reaped at the individual level, more specifically at the gene level of those who are participating in this, in the executions of tyrannical individuals or troublemaking individuals.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. No, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay. I also think, sorry, just moving forward just a little bit, Wrangham makes an important point. What we call moral, he doesn't, generally speaking, that which is referred to as moral is not necessarily that which is good. It's that which invokes moral psychology. So he points out that, and this is in reference to some other work, which suggests, this is work by Fisk and Rye. This is at the top of page 202. They recently published a book on virtuous violence, is the title of this book. And they argue that all violence is morally motivated. That is, it's always tinged by, or it's always sort of enveloped by concerns of what is right and wrong. And sometimes violence is inflicted because it is thought to be the right thing to do. It is thought to be good and just that a tyrannical male is killed by the leading, coalition, by the coalition of adult males in that community. That is, it's the violence itself is regarded as morally justified and morally good. And so he says on page 202, he says, Fisk and Rye considered every type of violence they could think of, including genocide, witch killings, lynchings, gang rapes, war rape, war killings, homicides, revenge, hazing, and suicide. Their conclusion was clear. Most violence is motivated by moral emotions. So the definition of morality that that is Wrangham, will follow here is not limited to altruism and cooperation. I take moral behavior to be behavior guided by a sense of right and wrong. So that which is moral is not necessarily what we would sort of loosely think of that which is good. It's behavior that's motivated by concerns for right and wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Right. And I mean, Wrangham at some point in this chapter says that when when talking about group morality, or, what is done for the good of the group, often has a sort of limited definition of group. And specifically, he talks about how the women in these tribal or traditional societies are often exploited or abused, or they end up basically getting the short end of the stick, to put it sort of mildly. And the good of the group is usually this coalition of males, or the cousins that you refer to.
Yeah, right. So it's a very circumscribed group for which it's good.
Right.
Right. And at the same time, when one piece of that group reaps benefits, another piece of that group, endures costs that are inflicted. And so this global reference to group selection often doesn't make a lot of sense when you start to dig down in what's actually going on. Okay, so a little bit further in this chapter, Wrangham presents three, what he refers to as big problems for our evolved moral psychology. So he says on page 206, he says, so the first big problem about our evolved moral psychology is why, when we give or receive, we do not behave like Homo economicus, or chimpanzees. Why, he says, why have we evolved such apparently self-sacrificial tendencies? Why do we give up some benefits, when we could take them all? Why do humans seem to take only a portion of the benefits so that another group member can take a portion of benefits? In other words, why don't we behave as what he calls Homo economicus, purely rationally? But it's clear that, and based on some of the work that he later discusses, humans don't always behave apparently in their own individual interests. They will take benefits, but they won't take more benefits than they think that others think they deserve. Okay? because then they'll end up foregoing, what they would have received. In other words, it's humans, and arguably humans uniquely, that appear capable of moderating the benefits that they take, taking more of a long-term perspective, okay, giving up short-term benefits for long-term gain. And this is not something you often see in other species, and some have argued it's something you never see in other species.
Well, so what he's talking about there with the humans don't behave like chimpanzees. In addition to not only trying to take only their fair share so that they don't seem selfish, he also talks about work or the experiment in which chimpanzees are offered donations by another chimpanzee, and how chimpanzees will never reject what are unfair offers. Basically, they could be given more by a donor, but chimpanzees never reject small unfair offers, whereas humans very frequently will. So not only are they sort of keeping their own morality in check, they're also sort of turning their nose up at what they view as, and this is humans, turning their nose up at unfair offers. So in that sense, their morality or their sense of fairness or right and wrong is sort of being extended almost harmfully so to other people. And I think that's what he was referencing with the Homo economicus, basically not necessarily maximizing their own benefits in order to, enact some sense of morality or justice.
That's right. That's right. And all of this, well, and this is one of several dimensions of human behavior, of human psychology and behavior, that suggest a very intense concern with not just that you are behaving in ways that meet social and approved expectations, social appropriate, but that others are doing so as well. And as Gavin just mentioned, we will inflict punishments on others for behavior that we think is wrong, even if inflicting those punishments simultaneously subjects us to costs that we could have avoided. There's something deeply important to humans about behaving morally defensively, okay, not just for oneself, but for others. Okay?
Did you want to move on to the second problem, or did we have more to say
Yes.
about? Okay.
Yes, let's move on to the second major problem. Go ahead.
Oh, so just how we come to classify some actions as right and others as wrong. And I think this is where he talks about some of the universal moral senses that you referenced earlier.
Such as the inaction bias, the side effect bias, and the non-contact bias. Right? These are all biases, and we'll let you guys read a little bit more about them. They're part of evolved human psychology. They're the sorts of biases that you see in every culture for which we have data. Okay? It's considered more wrong to do something by committing some act than it is to have the same outcome by omitting an act. There's something more wrong about engaging behavior and actually doing something rather than not doing something, even if the result is the same. So that's one of them. Another one is what he calls a side effect bias, and then again, the non-contact bias. All of these are part of the bells and whistles of human evolved moral psychology that appears to be deeply, deeply concerned with what others think of what I'm doing. Not only with what others think of what I'm doing, but that's part of the bigger picture that we're looking at here. An evolved morality that is specifically interested in either demonstrating one's valued social reputation or displaying behavior that demonstrates displeasure with someone else's failure to meet social expectations, or by virtue of not doing what was morally right.
Right. And he mentions that, these biases are pretty well studied, and I think uh, pretty well replicated in, like,
Yes.
cross culturally. So, but he does say that they are unconscious and unexplained. So, the exact selection pressures for these particular moral biases that sort of underlie universal morality aren't necessarily uh, horribly well understood, but there they are.
Yeah, I mean, and for his purposes, for Wrangham's purposes, they appear to be consistent with, again, a motivated interest in what others think of oneself,
Right.
and maintaining social status, and maintaining one's place in the good graces of the tyranny of cousins, in terms of how Wrangham would be framing this. Okay, the third major puzzle is about, on page 209, the third major puzzle about our moral psychology is why, says Wrangham, why as a species we have evolved to be so sensitive to the abstract notions of right and wrong that we monitor one another's behavior and even sometimes intervene to punish someone whose behavior we disapprove of. And once again, this is something that appears to be arguably unique to humans. I say arguably because there are people who are investigating whether it actually is unique to humans, but we do have this intense concern with what others are doing or not doing. Third party morality, so to speak.
Right. And that sort of gets back to the rejection of unfair offers that I mentioned previously, and other types of policing other people's behavior or concern for what others are doing, and which also sort of gets to uh, the gossip and exchange of social information about other people within a group.
That's right. And again, I think part of Wrangham's argument turns on the fact that humans are the only species that have an advanced verbal communication system. In other words, language. That we have a system of communicating with one another about one another, okay? And in fact, other people have provided evidence. And I think that Wrangham might reference this, that most of what we talk about is would fall within the category of gossip. Okay, who's doing what to whom? When did they do it? Why did they do it? This is what people all over the world spend time talking about, is the extent to which people are meeting or failing to meet social expectations. And this is part of why we, according to Wrangham, are so deeply concerned with what other people think, because they're talking about it. And this can have consequences, such as being ostracized, or indeed, ancestrally, such as being killed for, apparent wrongdoing. So towards the end of this section, he is, sort of summarizing things here on page 212, and he says, the three moral questions that I've outlined concern, this is just by way of also summarizing, the three moral questions that I've outlined concern why humans are exceptionally pro-social, why we are guided as we are in deciding right from wrong, and why we care so much that we are prepared to intervene when we see wrong done. He notes that Christopher Bem suggests that a solution to these problems lies in the claustrophobic small groups in which capital punishment was a realistic threat for troublemakers. Okay, and that's sort of the diamond, piece of text right here. Okay, it points at the execution hypothesis once again as sort of providing the broad framework that helps to knit all of this together from Wrangham's perspective. Now, yeah, he goes on to sort of remind us that on page 214, despite the various cross-cultural variations and differences, everywhere the same was true, he says, at the bottom of page 214. A coalition of men controlled life and death according to rules that they set. Okay? Once men dominate the society, beginning on page 215, once men dominate the society through their control of death, their words become law. Their word becomes law. Everyone knows the importance of conforming. People accept the inequities. Men get the best food, have the best freedom, and are the ultimate arbiters of group decisions. Bem calls the egalitarian system of male relationships found among nomadic hunter-gatherers a, quote, reverse dominance hierarchy. The term recognizes that any would-be alpha would be dominated by a coalition of males. Others prefer the term counter-dominant hierarchy, since an alpha male defeated by a coalition becomes part of it rather than having his position reversed. Then he goes on to say the revolution that first brought down the alpha bullies during the mid-Pleistocene had given the new leaders extraordinary power. Okay, some 300,000 years ago, moving on just a tiny bit, some 300,000 years ago, that is with the origin of humans, of modern humans, males discovered absolute power. They had surely been individually dominant to females before the onset of capital punishment, just as chimpanzees are. Afterward, however, the dominance of males over females took a new form. It became a patriarchy in the special sense of male dominance based on a system. The system was a network of mature males protecting their mutual interests.
Right, and that's kind of how it's still a few pages off, but that's sort of how he leads into the next chapter of Overwhelming Power, and explains that, the power granted to coalitions of men not only toppled the much, comparatively smaller power of individual aggressive bully males, but also led to the extreme or large amounts of power of the coalitions that ran early human civilizations and despotisms or monarchies or whatever uh, political label you want to ascribe to those. But
Right, absolutely. And so just to sort of summarize this chapter and then uh, lead us into the next one, then let me just take a moment to do what Wrangham does, which is to summarize this chapter. Okay, and I'm looking at Wrangham's page 221. He has a very nice summary of a lot of these ideas in one place. Okay, again, I think this is good writing. I mean, he's gone through a lot of material in this chapter, and I think it's potentially super helpful in terms of getting the gist of the chapter. So we want to point you to this summary paragraph, or last couple of paragraphs on page 221. Okay, so Wrangham says, following Christopher Bem, okay, that's the anthropologist, the primatologist that he was referencing, that really he credits with the execution, the original presentation of the execution hypothesis, although Bem didn't call it that. He says, following Christopher Bem, the core idea in this chapter is that our moral psychology was forged during a period when being a social outcast was even more dangerous than it is for most people today. The essential social nature of moral behavior is clear to all scholars, and the belief that much moral behavior is concerned with avoiding and giving censure is also widespread. However, alternative scenarios for establishing the origins of morality based on the benefits of cooperation have not normally charged social ineptitude, which costs as high as the execution hypothesis does. When the risk of being a nonconformist is that you will be executed, it is easy to imagine intense selection in favor of moral sensibilities that maintain you as part of the in-group. Okay, and then Wrangham asks us, think of Kulebach's son. The risks he took were indeed large, and he lost. Deviance have been handled similarly everywhere in the past. Such effective social control makes Bem's theory of moral origins unnervingly appealing. If Bem is right, the new mentality of which humanity is rightly proud had darker origins than we normally like to think. The force that bred conscience and condemnation into our ancestors began in the revolution of males competing for a new kind of power. It ended in a tyranny of the cousins, with two major kinds of social effect. On the one hand, in Jonathan Haidt's words, it binds and builds. It constrains society to follow moral principles that promote cooperation, fairness, and protection from harm. It has brought a new kind of virtue to the world. On average, everybody benefited. On the other hand, it also brought a new kind of dominance, because the limited power of a single alpha became the absolute power of a male coalition. And that leads us directly into chapter 11, overwhelming power. This is the sort of power that Wrangham has just referenced. The coalition of adult males, the tyranny of cousins, okay, has the ability, as Gavin mentioned and as Wrangham just mentioned, to inflict or engage or enact overwhelming power, not just power, but overwhelming power. Power so great that it can, it all but cannot be challenged. When there are multiple adult males forming a coalition, okay, with mutual interests and goals in mind, it becomes all but unstoppable. And what Wrangham's doing in this chapter is playing that out just a bit. Okay, and if you look at page 224, he has a nice sort of opening summary where he says, this is the middle of page 2, explained how proactive aggression appears to be responsible for virtue. In this chapter and the next, I consider its contrasting consequences, those that show its responsibility for making humans an especially violent and despotic species. Proactive aggression gives us a key for solving the goodness paradox. Even though it made us into a calmer, gentler species, it also brought evil.
Yeah, and I think he talks in this chapter about warfare as one of the key sorts of consequences of this increased proactive aggression in conjunction with the forming of coalitions. So basically, these groups of men who control their own group, using their proactive or planned aggression to enact hostilities or commit violence against other groups or other civilizations.
Yes, absolutely. And he does make a distinction between sort of ancestral warfare and then modern warfare. So in this chapter, he's really playing out the application of these ideas to ancestral warfare. That is warfare among nomadic groups and hunter-gatherers. Much of this warfare, if we want to call it warfare, it's often referred to as raiding. We can call it warfare. I mean, it's the same basic psychology that we see in modern warfare, but we'll hold off on that just yet. But right, I mean, coalitions of adult males, when acting with forethought and planning and proactively, can inflict terrible costs on a different group of people, a different tribe, outsiders, particularly when this is done by surprise. But doing something by surprise requires coordination, intense coordination. It requires a plan, a time. How are we going to do this? Okay, what time will we start? Who will lead? Who will go around one side? Who will go around the other? This is something that is arguably unique. I don't even know if it's arguably unique. It's almost certainly unique to humans. This feature of coalitionary proactive aggression, where it's planful, it's plotting.
And is it also here in this chapter where he talks about how a lot of this kind of aggression, this raiding, only occurs when the group is all but certain that they're going to be successful?
That's right.
The ones who at least initiate the raid.
Right, which again speaks to the thoughtfulness of what they're doing, the planfulness. I mean, there is some work, and Wrangham refers to it, that groups of adult males among chimpanzees will occasionally, particularly when they have a variety of other needs met, will occasionally, if they have the patrol, sort of the edge of their territory. And it's not clear what they're doing or why they're doing it, but what happens when they stumble upon a stranger, that is a male or a female from, a rival group, is they will attack and kill that individual. They will beat that individual to death. Now, it's not at all clear. It seems to be the case that this is what happens if they happen to stumble upon, a single individual from a rival troop. It does not appear to be the case that there's any thoughtfulness or planfulness about what they're doing. And part of the problem may be that they just can't speak to us in words and tell us what they're doing. But we also know that they don't engage in, in what we recognize anyways as sort of planning. And they sort of just start walking.
Right. Wrangham also talks at decent length about infanticide in this chapter, and I can't quite remember exactly how he ties it into the overall theme of this chapter. Do you remember what the tie-in is?
Yeah. So let's just direct students to page 233, where, let's see, he makes reference, he says, as with infanticide, the debate is now settled. The coalitionary killing of adults is not common, but it is a characteristic feature of chimpanzees independent of human activity. Okay, so we know that infanticide occurs in many different species. We also know, let me just find where he's opening this discussion of infanticide. Where does that start?
Infanticide, by the way, for students, is just the killing of one's own offspring, usually shortly after it's born.
Well, or an offspring. It may or may not be one's own offspring, right?
Okay.
It's the killing of an infant. Yeah. And let me just see where he picks this up. Partly he uses the research on infanticide. He reports the history of research on infanticide. Prior to the 1970s, instances of infanticide were interpreted as instances of pathology, that obviously there's something wrong. Why else would adults kill infants? Obviously there's something wrong, and that obvious something often was pinned on human interference. Humans are starting to build into their woodlands, or humans are overfeeding or underfeeding, or otherwise, infringing on the freedoms of these otherwise wild species. And it was Sarah Hrdy, who in 1977 offered what she called the sexual selection theory of infanticide. This was the hypothesis that infanticide occurs, that infanticide is the intended outcome of an adult male who takes over a new group of primates, and these were Langer monkeys. When the male comes into the territory, he takes over the territory, he ousts the alpha male, and then he proceeds to kill every infant in that group. Why he does this is because his ancestors that killed the infants did better than those earlier monkeys, Langer monkeys, that didn't kill those infants. In part because those infants do not share his genes. They cannot possibly have been sired by him. And so what you see is males that enter into a troop, or a group, or a pride, males that infiltrate, one of the first things they'll do is kill the existing infants. That has the consequence of removing the genes of rival males, while also and simultaneously initiating estrus in the adult females. That is, the females become much more likely to ovulate and ovulate sooner, or go into estrus sooner, and they then mate with the male that just took over the group. So this is a non-pathology sort of interpretation, and what part of what Wrangham wants to do is argue that terrible behaviors in humans also might not be indicative of pathology, but might be interpretable from an evolutionary psychological perspective. Okay. I mean, these can still be regarded as terrible behaviors, but they nevertheless may well have a logical, scientific explanation based in natural selection.
Right, meaning that,
Yeah.
the ancestors who performed these acts may have had an adaptive benefit, or, infanticide in certain situations may have had an adaptive benefit, similar for humans, as in the Langer monkeys or in sometimes even chimpanzees.
That's right. And so that's what I think he's doing with this with somewhat extended example of infanticide. Because, I mean, there are still, I mean, there was, prior to the 1970s, absolutely the consensus was that infanticide is a goof, that infanticide is indicative of something wrong going on. And it still lives as a hypothesis, even today, despite the fact that, there is very clear evidence in favor of the sexual selection hypothesis of infanticide. I mean, partly it's that uh, scientists are humans, and humans, normal, non-psychopathic humans, have a hard time getting their head around natural selection having produced adaptations that motivate despicable behavior, morally despicable behavior, like killing infants.
Right. And then he sort of transitions from there into talking about coalitionary proactive aggression against uh, adults and other groups. It looks to be that's the next sort of topic that he gets into, and he talks about how it's relatively rare, but mostly, or I think he even says exclusively occurs in social carnivores and primates.
Right, like wolves, lions, spotted hyenas, chimpanzees, white-faced capuchins. He does note it's arguably, it arguably occurs in various ants and a few other species. So it's relatively rare. And when it does occur, it's most likely, if you're seeing it, you're looking at a social carnivore, right? Coalitionary proactive aggression. So you know, it does occur in other species, but again, I think he, addresses this at various other places, including in this chapter. There's something much more planful and plotting about human coalitionary proactive aggression than about anything we might call coalitionary proactive aggression in other species, including our closest phylogenetic relatives, chimpanzees.
Because of our ability to, plan and,
And to talk,
right.
to talk about these things. I mean, you can only communicate so much when you don't have language, particularly when your interest is in planning and plotting and preparing, for, a group, level sort of attack or raid. Again, it's not to say that there aren't species that do band together, that where males will work apparently together to overpower a smaller number of males from a rival group. They do it, okay, among the social carnivores. And in fact, it's thought to be, the leading cause of death, is being throttled basically by a rival group of adult males.
Right.
So, but I think what Wrangham wants us to do is to appreciate that there may be an order of magnitude difference in the extent to which these attacks are planned, plotted, and sort of coordinated.
Yes. Yeah. And, well, also in that they are more common than some anthropologists or people who study these traditional tribal societies might have previously argued. So similar to infanticide, it's not rare. It's not indicative of pathology. It's relatively common that this type of aggression, this coalitionary proactive aggression occurs.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, far more common in tribal societies and hunter gatherer societies than it is in the modern world.
Right. Yes.
No coalitionary proactive aggression historically and ancestrally is a much more intense selection pressure, produced a much more intense selection pressure for humans um, than it does today.
Right. Contrary to the idea espoused by some people that modern societies are more violent, or than tribal societies. And even at the end of this chapter, he references Steven Pinker and Enlightenment Now, which we referenced earlier in the course when we linked Steven Pinker's lecture video on the declining violence of modern societies, or declining rates of violence. I
That's
should
right.
say.
That's right. Absolutely. So the last thing he tackles, or one of the last things he tackles in this chapter, is how to account for the origin of coalitionary proactive aggression. And he concedes, this is on page 240, no one knows for certain how coalitionary proactive aggression came to be so prevalent a part of human behavior. Two reasons suggest an origin in intergroup aggression. This is on page 240. He says, first, between group aggression is where coalitionary proactive aggression is most common in animals. Within groups, by contrast, there's little evidence for it. Okay, so that's one line of evidence. The second reason on the next page, page 242, the second reason for thinking that coalitionary proactive aggression developed primarily in the context of intergroup interactions is that it makes fewer cognitive demands than the same behavior expressed within groups. I mean, if you're not with us, you're against us, right? You don't have to get complicated with, in terms of the relationships within the group. It's fairly straightforward. He says, in short, this is at the bottom of page 242, complex calculation and refined communication are needed to make within-group killing a successful adaptive strategy. By contrast, in intergroup interactions, the formula is simple. Side with your friends against the enemy. So I thought that was kind of an interesting argument, an interesting couple of observations.
Yeah, no, I agree. So that's basically Wrangham's explanation for the motivation behind intergroup violence, right? Like just the formation of one group having its own interests, sort of self-contained um, within itself, and that being in conflict with the interests of outgroups or other groups, for whatever, mating or access to resources.
Right, territory. I mean, that's right. So there's a sense in which ancestrally, human groups didn't just leave well enough alone. Why? Because there were always additional benefits to be had.
Right.
Um, okay, and he closes the chapter with reference to a couple of phenomena that I think are very interesting. We'll just take just a moment to point them out. He argues that on page 244, the advanced skills of proactive aggression in humans licensed forms of despotism not found in other primates. Obedience and sovereignty are potent examples. So he says obedience is a uniquely human relationship. Okay. A human leader does not have to fight personally. A coalition of supporters guarantees the value of the leader's threat, and the likely danger from an aggressive encounter is low for the supporting coalition because their overwhelming power can be brought to bear on the subordinate. All of which is to say, Wrangham wants to argue that obedience, the ability to command the behavior of others, and an interest in fulfilling those commands is something that appears to be unique to humans, and uniquely a consequence of proactive coalitionary aggression. Do you want to say anything further on that? On the topic of obedience?
Not I don't think so. He gets into modern warfare. Well, that's in the next chapter, and I think that
Yeah,
I sort of want to leave that for next week, because I think there are some aspects of obedience that he talks about that are pretty interesting. But I think it's everything that's coming to mind is more so in reference to or relevant to the next chapter. So I'm good to leave it there. But if
sure.
you have anything else to say,
No, that's fine. I think the reason he's bringing them up now is to make the argument that in order to understand the phenomenon of obedience and to understand the phenomenon of sovereignty, which refers to maintaining unique control over substantial areas of land, um, he wants to argue that obedience and sovereignty depend on an evolutionary history of proactive coalitionary aggression or coalitionary proactive aggression. So in other words, it's only in those species where the overwhelming power of tyrannical males, the overwhelming power of tyrannical cousins, right? These groups of adult males banding together, only in such species, which really only leaves us with humans, would you see the phenomena of obedience, an interest in doing the bidding of others, namely the adult males that run the show, and sovereignty. Okay, that is the sort of recognition that areas of land are controlled by these groups of tyrannical cousins, the tyranny of cousins, groups of males, adult males, working together to maintain control. So he argues you don't see obedience and sovereignty in any other species because you don't see the same level of coalitionary proactive aggression in other species. The planfulness, the plannedness, okay, the coordinated integration of motives and goals. So, I mean, that remains to be discussed, but I thought it was an interesting sort of set of thoughts.
no, that's a good point, and I think that made sense why he is referencing it here because it is in reference to the overwhelming power, um, that is the title of the chapter,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is sort of the power granted to these coalitions of men that would be out of reach for individual aggressive males or alpha males, and that is sort of conceptually out of reach for non-human animals also. So,
yeah. So the argument goes, anyways.
right.
Seems reasonable. Okay, well that wraps up chapter 11 on overwhelming power. So next time in our last discussion, we will discuss chapters 12. Chapter 12 is on war, the application of these ideas to war. And chapter 13, he titles Paradox Lost. So it's a bit of a summary chapter, a briefer chapter. And then he closes with what he titles an afterword, which we'll get to when we get to. All right.
Okay. Yep.
Very good. Thank you.